So far, we've talked about in detail step 1 of the scientific method, which is making an observation. Okay, so we always have to start with that because that will lead us to step 2, which is asking a question. So the third step that we'll talk about today is step 3, making a hypothesis. So this will be the third step in the scientific method. In the scientific method is to plan and do an experiment with your step 4, which is experimenting. The hypothesis is the third step in the scientific method. Now, what exactly is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a precise and testable statement of what the researcher or scientist predicts will be the outcome of the study. It is stated at the start of the study. So when they're talking about the word study here, you could think of the experiment meaning the same thing, okay? So let's go over these words a little bit more carefully so we understand. So precise means that whatever you are guessing, because a hypothesis is an educated guess, we want to make sure that it's precise, which means that it is specific. You don't want to be too vague about this. So something that's vague would be something that doesn't have details in it. Okay? So if you say something like, "Oh, I think something will happen," that's not precise. That's vague. Precise would be, I think that when I add 2 drops of this liquid to this bottle, the bottle will explode in 10 seconds. Okay, so that's a guess that's very precise, very specific. And so you want to be specific in your hypothesis. The other word that's really important is testable. Whatever you decide your hypothesis is, since the next make sure that your hypothesis can lead to an experiment. So if you can't experiment with your hypothesis, it's not a great hypothesis. And then the last thing I want to mention is doing your hypothesis or stating it at the start of your experiment. So a lot of students get really excited about the actual experiment and then they forget to do this before they start. So always make sure you create a hypothesis before you start. It should be precise, which you can think of the word specific, which is the opposite of vague. We don't want vague. We don't want it to be bland. We want to be specific. It's testable, and it should be created at the start of your experiment. Okay. So now I'm going to bring up our question format from step 2 of the scientific method, which is asking a question. Because once we have this question, we can easily create a hypothesis from this question. So let's think of an example that we can create a question from. So let's say we use the example of smoking, right? So lots of people smoke. There's debate over, how bad is it for you? So what is a question that we could first come up with just from the observation that people smoke? So let's just go super simple. Let's say, how does smoking affect our lungs? Right? Because when we breathe in air or in this case, a combination of smoke and air, it's going into our lungs. So this would be a decent question because we've used the format that we've learned here. And from here, I can create a hypothesis, okay? And it's quite simple. The only things you want to make sure you do are, you want to include the words if and the word then. The words if and then. Okay? And so it's sort of like our question where we had these sort of mandatory words up here that should go in all questions. For the hypothesis, we should put if and then in all of our hypotheses. And then it doesn't get super complicated from here. Here's the next step. You're going to talk about your first blank in your question. You're going to talk about it in the first blank of your hypothesis. And you're going to talk about the second blank in your question, whatever you wrote there. You're going to talk about that in the second blank of your hypothesis. So then you got to start thinking, well, what's my educated guess? What do I think is going to be the relationship between smoking and my lungs? And one of the common hypotheses is, if I smoke, then my lungs won't be healthy. Okay, this would be a perfectly fine hypothesis because you're mentioning both parts of the question in these blanks, and you've used if and then. Okay, so that is a perfectly fine hypothesis. From here, we would design and plan an experiment to see if this hypothesis is correct or incorrect. And we'll talk about those steps later. So just the format should include if and then with a couple of blanks there. And then we should always create the hypothesis while we're looking at our question. Okay, it should come straight from our question. We should fill in these blanks here. All right, so that's how we write a hypothesis from a question in science.